Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham Dhammam Sangham Namasami. So we've arrived at a category that everybody anticipates. It's often what people wait for, because we come to practice to purify the heart and mind, to be happy, to be free of strife and conflict. So when there are difficult people in relationships in our life, we want to fix that. It's totally natural to want to be free from that suffering. So I want to speak quite specifically tonight about that particular kilesa that we're working with here, dosa. Remembering what we've already discussed about both the psychological and the deeper Dhamma roots of this state. So remembering that its ultimate roots are that sense of I, me, and mine, connected with that comparing of better than, worse than, equal to, and craving. We don't have to remember that detail, but the main message is it's all conditioned. And we can't decondition ourselves, that's impossible. But we can retrain ourselves. And our habits and tendencies to anger, those personality traits, they may seem quite fixed, but they're actually not, not at all. So remembering the flexibility of the mind, it's infinitely flexible. The buzzword about this is neuroplasticity. That's the technical term for that. And neuroplasticity applies to everybody, no matter how old we are. It's not that the older you get, the more fixed you get. That's a choice, and we don't have to choose that. So if you have a strong habit of anger of any sort, dosa of any sort, please do not feel discouraged by that, and understand that in cultivating particularly mudita, you are creating a new habit, moment to moment to moment to moment. That's why we repeat this phrase over and over again. We're creating a habit. So a habit of mudita as opposed to a habit of anger, resentment, jealousy, envy. And sometimes the more we have to work in the practice, the more challenging it is. The deeper the habit that we're creating also is. There's a relationship there. So we've spoken already about how when we do the mudita practice, when we cultivate mudita, it brings forth our hidden tendency, anger, resentment, ill will. And what's so interesting is, especially if you're familiar with the metta practice, is to notice the different flavor of what's being brought in. With metta, often it's fear. That aspect of dosa that moves away. And with mudita, it's often hidden levels of irritation, anger, ill will, rebellion. Rebellion is so interesting. Sometimes it feels doing this practice like we're transformed into a 2-year-old child having a temper tantrum. And it can be quite shocking. It's like, who is this person? This is the wild mind I was speaking of, I think, in this small group or in one of the questions today. And the Buddha spoke so beautifully about using the metaphors of the practice being of taming a wild elephant or a valuable horse. At the time of the Buddha, an elephant, a war elephant particularly, or a valuable horse, these are extremely valuable and precious beings. To be respected and treated well and trained kindly. And I think this is such a beautiful metaphor because our minds are the same. They're precious. They're to be respected. This mind is to be respected, trained with kindness. And when you train a horse, I don't know about elephants, I've never trained one, but I've trained horses. And they're big, they're powerful, and they strike out easily and they run away easily. First, you treat them kindly and with respect so that they trust you. And a consistent kindness and respect. And having gentled a flighty horse, then you can train that horse. It's the same with the mind. And it's why these Brahma-vihara practices are so incredibly valuable. Because they bring into the foreground this gentle respect and this really profound acceptance. This mind, this heart, they are the way they are. So we apply a gentle, consistent kindness. And this is, we talk about faith in the Buddha's teaching, but it's also a lot about trust. And if we are inconsistent in being kind and gentle about ourselves and this mind and heart, that doesn't foster trust. So when we can develop a consistent inclination, even if we don't really feel it, away from ill will, judgment, hatred, force, then the practice becomes so much smoother because there is that consistency, there is that trust. So there's so many ways we can experience dosa. And in the practice, a lot of that detail is not important. So the dosa that we experience in the mudita practice can be a story about that person we're radiating the mudita for. And that, of course, is very common. That's a very common thing to have arise in the practice. It can be directed at ourselves. It can even be directed at the practice. And this can be particularly amusing. We're cultivating this Brahma-vihara to be free from dosa, and we hate the practice itself. It's just it's like, oh. If we can separate ourselves from the experience, it's actually quite funny. But because this is a relation of practice, all that dosa can be quite intense, and it can go in all those different directions. The first thing to remember about all of this is the force of stories we tell ourselves about that anger. Because we can really get caught in the stories we tell ourselves. So maybe it's the story of what happened between us and that other person and how wrong they are. Maybe it's a story about ourselves and how hopeless we are at dealing with this and how we'll never get out of it. Maybe it's a story about the practice and how, well, maybe this isn't for me and how ridiculous it is and it'll never work. And sometimes, sometimes all three of those can coincide. When I say it doesn't matter, what I mean is part of the process of this practice is purification. A big part of this practice is purification. And in that purification process, we will see, it will be all of the dosa, that either tendencies, latent dosa, or undigested dosa, all of that will be revealed to us. And it sometimes feels like there's this mass of habitual tendency for dosa. There it is. And it takes whatever is convenient as an object. So maybe that other person is a convenient object. Or maybe we're the most convenient object. Or maybe there's this free-floating dosa and it takes the practice as an object. We don't have to take care of those stories and figure out those stories to purify the heart and mind of this dosa. We don't have to do anything with those stories. First of all, who knows if they're true? And second of all, the purification has nothing to do with the stories we tell ourselves. The mudita practice elicits and reveals our tendencies for dosa. It brings those tendencies to the surface. And that dosa takes any convenient object. It could be another person, it could be ourselves, it could even be the practice. And anger being what it is, of course, there will be stories about all of that. So those stories are basically just a convenient explanation for what this anger thing is here. They give that voice, but those stories may or may not be true. We may think, we have this angry story about another person in our life. But really, perhaps what just happened is we tapped into that tendency for anger, and the thought of that other person was there and convenient. Mean that angry story is particularly important. It just means that was the most convenient object in the moment. It can be so interesting to watch where the mind goes with this if you don't allow it to hook into a particular story. And it's much harder to see this in the mudita practice than it is to see it in vipassana, because the mudita practice gives us an object that, a relational person, and to which the anger can be attached. So in this mudita practice in particular, because the anger can be quite strong, it's really important not to immediately believe the stories your mind is telling you about the content. I mean, it's always important, but in this practice particularly, because we can get really stuck there. So as purification does its job, and as we train the heart, as we gentle the heart, of course, remembering force never works. So as we notice the stories and just let them be there, it's really important not to try to or not to in any way try to avoid feeling that anger, and it's really important not to suppress that anger. And it's especially important we not try to force the mind to turn to mudita. We do this gently. And this is where humor is very important, because it allows us to kind of unhook from all those stories without any force. It's a gentle, very loving kind of humor. It's very helpful. And then we present the mind with the mudita phrase as another object to kind of chew on, so to speak. This is where, you can use a lot of energy to say, no, we're going this way. That's force. But think of it in the very same way as either the training of the wild animal metaphor or 2-year-old with a tantrum metaphor. If a 2-year-old is having a tantrum, you don't grab their arm and march away with them saying, shut up. So force and harshness in the practice can often create an almost volcanic, an experience of a almost volcanic energy of resistance. When it gets to this place, the only thing we can do is to just press the pause button on practice, open it up completely, and practice in a more open, gentle way. Go for a walk or do stopping meditation. Carol Wilson taught me how to do that. It is very, very useful. You don't indulge in the anger, but you move the body in a really forceful way. And it never takes very long, maybe once back and forth doing that, you start laughing. It really breaks the spell of the anger, and humor does that. Humor is very, very useful. The most important thing is the continuity of kindness, the continuity of a kind attitude. And that's what creates that willingness, that trust. So in the text, the Majjhima Nikaya particularly, the Buddha gives very specific instructions on how to deal with anger. And the very first thing to do is to cultivate kindness, cultivate metta, which is so funny because in this practice, when the practice is revealing the dosa, well, the very first thing to do is just keep going. So kindly, gently, as much as you can, and however you can, keep inclining to mudita. Remembering that mudita is in itself a form of metta. But if it just begins to get bigger and bigger, then you can go specifically to metta for yourself. And it's really important to do that without an agenda that the anger go overnight. So the phrase is really important. Language here is extremely important. So not may I be free from anger, that's an agenda. But what can be useful is either may I be at ease with this, or may I work with this skillfully, or may I be kind to this, and really embrace that whole experience. We acknowledge the anger, we put it aside, but then we embrace it with kindness. Remembering the importance of not feeding the story in any way, especially not trying to figure it out, not planning on how to fix it, just feeling it, feeling that anger as a physical experience. And then not also feeding it, going to stories is feeding it directly, not also feeding it indirectly, which means don't resist it. Don't try to get rid of it. Notice if there's any tension in the mind around it, like, I don't want this, I want this to go away. That's feeding it with resistance. And that indirect feeding of resistance, it may be the first thing that arises. And we don't have to stop doing that, but really to just notice, oh, there is an attitude that mind is really tight around this. That's all you need to do with that. It's just notice the resistance. It's like, oh, I really don't want this here. And the moment we acknowledge it kindly and then turn to, well, may I be at ease with this anyway, we've unplugged. We may not have unplugged from the anger itself, but we've unplugged from the resistance to it by acknowledging it and resting back in that experience and simply feeling it. So that's curbing the anger with metta, really limiting its ability to act through us, to affect us. And then the next thing the Buddha talks about, first he says, okay, the first thing you do is radiate metta. If that's difficult, then he says to do the second thing. And it's so interesting because when you know what metta arises from, it's very clear that what he is saying is, if the metta is impossible, you develop the ability to see the goodness, and from that, the metta will arise more naturally. So the second thing is, find something good about that person. Of course, we might not want to do that. The ego might be very strongly involved. There might be a lot of DT, a lot of mana, a lot of Dhamma. So we may have to apply a good deal of right effort to keep inclining to looking and noticing the goodness in that person. Looking for and noticing the goodness in that person. And it's such an interesting place in the practice because we are directly confronted with our own desire to suffer. We may think, oh, my whole life is about going towards nibbana, being free from greed, hatred, and delusion. But if our best friend says something a little off to us and we get really angry, we notice it's like we don't want to let that anger go. Or maybe somebody does something, maybe it's all tied up with jealousy. So, we can't even get close to that mudita. It's like we're angry, we're jealous, we're resentful, and we don't want to let it go. The Buddha has words for this. He says, don't give in to obstinacy. And don't give in to the obstinate, uncooperative mind. This is from a text that I really, really like. It's about the 7 dangers of anger. And he's talking about the dangers of anger. And it's a very long verse, and he goes through all these dangers. And at the very end, he says, the wise person should train in the Dhamma. Do not give in to, the word in English in that translation is recalcitrance. Do not yield to recalcitrance, obstinance. And I think this is so beautiful because at the very end, he says, the mind can be stubborn. Don't give in. And he speaks in the verse about this obstinacy being like the crust, the smoky crust that protects the fire. So it can be very helpful when faced with this obstinate mind to remember how dangerous anger is. And in this particular text, the Buddha speaks about how these 7 things are very gratifying for the person we're angry towards. And it's his way of, the modern way of putting it is being angry is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. And anger is that way. We think by indulging in it, somehow it affects the other person, but it's poisoning us. That's a bit helpful. So these 7 dangers that make our enemies happy are as follows. So first, it makes us ugly. Yeah, angry faces. I mean, it's really easy to see that in someone else. Second, it robs us of sleep. We can't sleep when we're angry. Third, we're not successful in what we're doing when we're overcome with anger. It causes loss of wealth, loss of friends. We become infamous rather than famous. We might want to be famous, but we become infamous. And if we keep cultivating it, we will be reborn in a terrible destination. So with this obstinate mind, with these habits, if we've done the practice, if we keep trying to incline to mudita and the mind doesn't want to do it, we try metta, the mind doesn't want to do it, it helps to reflect about these dangers. And just simply ask yourself, do you want to be ugly? Do you want to have no friends? Do you want to be poor? I mean, what do you want to feed? Or do you want to be happy and peaceful? So this practice is, it's so practical. If we try to do the practice and the mind is still being obstinate, then we can just reflect. It's like, okay, what do I want to feed and what do I want to starve? And, we're not stupid, but habit, that's all. It's just habit. And this practice is what gives us the capacity to form a new habit, that neuroplasticity. So in each moment, we choose. And we plant seeds for the future. We create the conditions for mudita to arise or anger to arise. You choose. It's so powerful and very humbling, actually. I mean, we see the tendencies of mind. We see how obstinate mind can be. But if we treat it respectfully and kindly, we can trust where this goes. So may through this mudita practice and all of our meditation practice, may we all be released from our habits of anger in the shortest possible time. Thank you for your kind attention, everybody. I know you can't really see, there's a ghost here on this.
There's a kind of alien coming from space.